When I was a kid, my cousin bought a devil mask for Halloween. Growing up in a super Catholic Mexican home, that was a big no. My aunt refused to have it in her house and was upset that he had bought it without consulting her. She has always been the most religious of the family. To appease her, my grandmother took the mask to her house. She hated it too, but she just shoved it in a shoe box in the closet and forgot about it. However, something really bizarre and terrifying happened when I was a kid. The house me and my grandmother lived in was very tiny. It was a 2-bedroom house that only had 2 entrances. The kitchen was the center of the home, and it had a plain view of the bedrooms and living room. The 2 entrances were in the kitchen, a small door that led to the backyard, and the front door in the living room. However, because the kitchen was the center of the house, you could see anyone that went in or out of the house from the kitchen. Essentially, that means that no one could sneak into the house without being seen by whoever was in the kitchen. So one day, my siblings and I are in the kitchen. My grandmother was the only other person in the house with us, but she was in the backyard watering the plants. She did that every morning when we ate breakfast, and we could see her that morning from the little window of the backyard door. Being kids, we start to bicker as we ate breakfast. I can't remember what we were chatting about, but it was something childish. My sister and I are raising our voices and arguing more and more lively. My brother tells us to stop because my grandmother will hear us and get mad, but then we hear something from one of the bedrooms. It sounded like someone was crying in one of the bedrooms. We could hear the sobs and hiccups of someone who was locked in one of the rooms. They sounded inconsolable. We looked at each other wondering who it was. We were alone in the house with our grandmother who was in the backyard, so it couldn't have been her. In our childish foolishness, we get up to go see. We walk to the bedrooms and see that only one is open. The guest room is open and no one is inside. The master bedroom has the door open a tiny bit but basically closed. We look through the little slit in the door and can see a woman with a white dress sitting on the corner of the bed with her head in her hands crying. She looks like my grandmother and is almost wailing. We look at each other wondering how she got in the room. She was in the backyard gardening. My sister turns around to go peek out the door to the backyard because we swore we could still hear the hose spraying outside. My brother and I get closer to the door and start inching the door open to go ask Grandma what's wrong. And then the woman lifts her face. Her hands are holding up my cousin's devil mask to her face. We scream and run. Our screaming gets our grandmother's attention, and she opens the door from the backyard. We're inconsolable, wondering what the hell is happening because she was just in the room behind us. She's frantic, asking us what's wrong, and we can only utter something about the bedroom and the devil. She goes into the master bedroom and throws the door open. There's no one there. She goes to the shoebox with the mask. It's still there. She just stares at us and asks what happened. When we tell her, she goes pale. She sees how frightened we are and knows we aren't lying, and she swears she didn't do it. She was in the backyard and couldn't have snuck in the house without us seeing it from the kitchen. The woman looked just like her, but it wasn't her. There was no explanation for it. My grandmother, in her Catholic mindset, told us that we probably drew the devil towards us by arguing. She tossed the mask in the trash and made us pray. However, she still maintains that it was not her that day. I believe her because she was super Catholic and definitely would not have touched that mask, much less wear it. Plus, there was no possible way she could have been in the master bedroom 1 minute and in the backyard the next. Still, my brother and I remember what we saw vividly and have no explanation for it. When I was about 9, my brothers and I stayed at my grandparents' for a weekend. They lived out in the boondocks in an area that had just been cleared and started to become developed. They were the 4th house built there, but the neighborhood next to the area was fully developed and populated. One night, my grandparents, my aunt, myself, and 3 brothers were all sitting outside in the light of the light post that was next to our house and by the still dirt road. We were watching a TV that was sitting on the windowsill but pointed outside. Those were hot nights in Mexico, so we sat outside in the cool breeze of the night. Out of nowhere, we start to hear a lot of barking. The dogs from the neighborhood nearby had started barking at something all at once. The barking reached the second neighborhood, and immediately the barking became an army. I've never heard anything like it since. So many dogs barking simultaneously, some crying, some howling, insanity. Suddenly we realized the dogs were coming en masse down the street towards us. We all jumped up to attention and just stared down the street. There, by the light of the farthest light post, a group of dogs came into view, and then more, and then more. The street was covered in dogs, except for one spot, right in the middle. They were all barking at this spot. My grandfather quickly grabbed his shotgun and walked right towards the mass of barking chaos. He thought it was a wild animal the dogs were chasing. He was one light post distance away when he stopped, put his shotgun down, and walked back to us. He told my grandma, "This is of no use here," gesturing at the shotgun. "This one is on you," he said. My grandmother was an extremely devoted Catholic and carried her Bible everywhere. It sat by the TV and she rushed over to grab it and quickly looked for a page on it. The dogs reached the light post my grandfather was at earlier, and we saw it. There in the middle of the dog pack was a woman walking down the street. She got closer and I saw what grandfather saw. She was floating about a foot off the ground. She was still making the gesture of walking, but her feet were nowhere near the ground. The dogs would take turns trying to bite her feet, but upon their attempt they would cry as if they got hurt and run back, and another dog would take its turn, and so on and on. My aunt became terrified and grabbed us kids. She tried to cover our eyes and yelled at us to not look at it. It became evident to me that this was a serious thing happening when my aunt, a non-Catholic, started praying. We were more curious than anything, weirded out by the scene but not scared, at least yet. My grandmother had started praying, and the dogs dissipated when they reached her. They just ran off in all directions, about 60 or more dogs that were still there. That's when I saw her up close and felt like my life changed. She had wavy hair that was flowing behind her as she walked, and no face. Nothing like a blur, but it was flat. It's hard to describe. The terror overtook me at that point and I couldn't look away. Her dress was like an old-timey summer dress that covered the shoulders and dropped to just above her ankles. I could almost see a print on it. Her feet were transparent, as was the bottom of her dress that trailed behind her like smoke. But not exactly like smoke, more like it was torn. She had a slight glow to her, like she was walking in midday, but her color was gone. She was pale. Her dress was pale and her hair was white. And no face. Our cries at that point triggered both my grandparents and my aunt to pull us into the house. As I was making my way into the house, I looked back and saw my grandmother holding her Bible and confronting this entity face to face. We could hear a woman screaming very loudly and suddenly crying, then cursing. We looked out the window to see the woman in white rapidly float over a nearby drainage canal and disappear. My grandmother walked back inside with a big grin on her face, and all she said was, "Don't worry, she won't be back." I was forced to become a believer that day. I didn't ask for it, nor did I want it. I suddenly was just a believer. When I was about 7 to 8 years old, I was visiting at my grandparents' house with my 2 cousins. The house is very secluded on the outskirts of a rural town. My mom, grandmother, and aunt were busy downstairs in a backroom spring cleaning. Us 3 girls were upstairs playing. Taking a lunch break, my aunt called out to us from the upstairs kitchen. We walked in the kitchen, and she asked us if we had been in her purse to play with her wallet. We said no, and she thought she was missing some money, around $20. Me and one cousin volunteered to look for the money in her car in case it fell out. We went to the car, looked around, and found nothing. My cousin accidentally slammed the door, and she told me not to tell Mom. She hates when I slam the door. I agreed, and we went back upstairs. Minutes passed, and we all started making sandwiches. My mother looked out the window and said, "Girls, you left the car door open." We ran to the window, and we kind of froze for a second. We assured them that we did not leave any car doors open and confessed to actually slamming the door that was open. At this point, things kind of started feeling creepy. First the wallet, now the car door. After watching the car for a while, We didn't see anyone, and my mom bravely said she would close the door so the interior lights wouldn't run the battery down. It was an old car. When she went outside and closed the car door, the landline to the house rang. My grandmother answered, and her face turned completely white. She started yelling for my mother to get in the house and lock the door now. We all got upstairs and we hunkered down in the corner of the room while my grandmother called 911. My mother reported feeling someone watching her when she was closing the car door. She also thought she saw a shadow inside our Astro van. It had tinted windows. Someone unknown to my grandmother on the phone said, "I know you're in there," and hung up. At this point, we're all scared and crying, waiting 30 to 45 minutes for the cops to show up. Finally, we see a police officer in the driveway and we all run outside. He starts taking a report of what happened with the money, car door, and phone call. As he's writing everything down, I yell to my mom, "There's smoke coming from the top of the house, the backside." My grandmother freaks out thinking she left a pot of beans on the stove and maybe the kitchen caught on fire. The police officer looks up and sees the smoke, calls in the fire department, and runs inside the house instructing everyone to stay outside. Moments later he comes back outside and is completely bewildered. Nothing is on fire, and the smoke outside is gone. The fire department and backup police arrive. They search the house and nearby land. They found nothing. To this day, we don't have a clue what happened, who the person was, where the money went, how they knew my grandmother's phone number, and what caused the smoke. The only speculation we made was the phone call was probably made from inside our van, as we had a mobile bag phone, before cell phones were popular. I was terrified as a kid and still shudder when thinking back on this.